A piece of red ochre, no larger than a human palm, sits behind glass in a museum in Cape Town. It was pulled from a cave called Blombos on the southern coast of South Africa, buried beneath layers of sand and silence for roughly 100,000 years. Across its surface, someone carved a series of cross-hatched lines, deliberate, repeated, geometric, not random scratches, a pattern, made by a hand that belonged to a person whose name, whose language, whose entire world has been forgotten. And yet the marks remain. What were they trying to say, and why did no one carry the message forward? Tonight, we're going to sit with that question, not rush toward an answer. This is a story about humanity's forgotten beginning, the long quiet stretch before recorded history, before cities, before writing, before anything we'd normally call civilization. We'll follow 3 traces left behind in stone and bone and buried pigment, moving from the oldest skulls ever found to the first signs of symbolic thought, to the moment still unexplained when human culture finally caught fire and never went out. But first, a sense of scale. Because the silence we're about to enter is enormous. Modern humans appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. We know this because of 5 skulls found in a cave called Jebel Ir-Hood in Morocco, dated through thermoluminescence of the stone tools buried alongside them and electron spin resonance of the teeth. Multiple methods, same answer. These people had faces like ours. Brain cases the same shape and volume, around 1400 cubic centimeters, the modern average. The areas associated with language, with planning, with abstract reasoning, all present, all developed. They had by every measurable standard the same hardware we carry now, and for the next 190,000 years they left almost nothing behind. No paintings, no jewellery, no elaborate burials, no objects that serve no practical purpose, just stone tools, the same teardrop-shaped hand axes flaked on both sides that their ancestors had been making for over 1 million years before them. Functional, effective, unchanged. If you compress the entire span of human existence into a single 24-hour day, everything you learned in a history classroom, the pyramids, the Roman Empire, the Industrial Revolution, this very night would fit into the last 4 minutes before midnight. The other 23 hours and 50 sec minutes belong to people we cannot name, speaking languages we will never hear, living lives that left no visible trace. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record. Nearly our entire story as a species sits in darkness. And yet these were not lesser people. Their brains were our brains. Their bodies were our bodies. They survived ice ages, droughts, volcanic winters that would have broken most species. They spread across the full breadth of Africa, adapting to a forest coastline, savannas, mountains. They knew every plant, every animal, every water source in their territory. That knowledge was sophisticated, complex, hard-won over generations. It simply wasn't the kind of knowledge that leaves marks on stone. Wood rots, leather decays, songs vanish into air, body paint washes away with the next rain. If they told stories around fires, and it seems almost impossible that they didn't, those stories are gone. We are left with the silence and the question of what the silence conceals. Here is where the mystery deepens, because the silence was not absolute. Around 100,000 years ago at Blombos, and a handful of other sites in southern Africa, faint signals appear. Oh, the carved ochre. Nacreous shells pierced and strung together, worn as beads. Someone wanted to look a certain way, someone wanted to be seen. That is culture fragile, early unmistakable. And then it vanished. The next archaeological layer at Blombos shows nothing. No more patterns, no more beads, just tools again. The same thing happens at other sites across the continent. A shell bead here, a scratched bone there, flickers of symbolic thought appearing and disappearing, like a candle trying to hold its flame in wind. For perhaps 50,000 years, human culture kept almost catching and going out. Some researchers suggest it was population. When groups grew large enough, ideas could spread and be taught, be maintained across generations. When populations crashed through drought, disease, or simple bad luck, the knowledge died with the people who held it. If only 40 or 50 individuals carry a tradition, one harsh season can erase it entirely. Others point to climate. For most of the past 300,000 years, much of Africa was drier, harsher, its habitable zones scattered and small. Groups lived in isolation, sometimes going years without encountering outsiders. Ideas that sparked in one valley may never have reached the next. Maybe culture needs connection. Maybe innovation requires not just intelligence, but density enough. Minds interacting enough attempts, accumulating enough failures absorbed by a population large enough to keep trying. Or maybe none of that is quite right. Maybe those early humans were fully cultural in ways that simply don't fossilize. Maybe 99% of what they created has disappeared, and we are reading the silence as emptiness when it may have been full. We don't know. That honesty matters. What we do know is that something shifted. The dates vary by region: 70,000 years ago, 50,000 perhaps earlier, in places we haven't excavated yet. But the pattern is consistent. Art appears. Tools diversify. Shell beads and ochre spread across sites hundreds of miles apart. Burials become elaborate, filled with objects that served no practical purpose. Humans begin acting in ways that are unmistakably recognizably human. Scientists call this moment by different names: the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the creative explosion, behavioral modernity. Each label frames the same deep puzzle. Why then? What unlocked capabilities that had been present dormant or invisible for 250,000 years? Some point to language reaching a critical complexity. Some suggest a cultural invention, a new way of teaching or organizing or remembering, that allowed knowledge to accumulate instead of resetting with every generation. A few once proposed a genetic mutation, a rewiring of neural architecture, but genomic studies have found no such switch. The genes of humans before and after the shift appear, as far as we can tell, the same. The hardware didn't change, something else did. Tonight we won't try to solve that puzzle. We'll do something quieter. We'll walk through the evidence: the skulls from Morocco, the carved ochre from Blombos, the shell beads that someone strung and wore and lost 100,000 years ago. We'll sit with the long silence and the sudden noise that followed it. We'll trace the path from the first faint flicker of symbolic thought to the moment it became a fire that spread across every continent and never burned out. The story begins in deep time where most of what happened will never be known, and in that darkness a hand reaches for a piece of red stone and begins to carve. The shape of silence. In 1961, workers cutting phosphate from a hillside quarry near the Atlantic coast of Morocco broke through a layer of calcium-crusted earth and found bone. The site was called Jebel Irhoud, and at first no one understood what lay inside it. Early analysis placed the remains at perhaps 40,000 years old, interesting but not extraordinary. The skulls were set aside, decades passed. The quarry kept digging. It was not until 2017 that a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin returned with newer dating methods, and the bones gave up a different answer entirely. Not 40,000 years, 300,000. The oldest known remains of Homo sapiens resting in a cave that had since been half destroyed by industrial mining, suddenly rewriting the opening chapter of our species. 5 individuals, fragments of skull jaw teeth, and surrounding them, dozens of stone tools flaked sharpened, used along with evidence of fire. The dating was confirmed through 2 independent techniques: thermoluminescence applied to the heated flint tools and electron spin resonance applied to the teeth themselves. Both pointed to the same window: 300 millennia. That number rearranges everything we think we know about ourselves, and it does so quietly without drama the way most important things happen. It means that the full span of what we call civilization, agriculture, cities, writing empires occupies less than 5% of the time our species has existed on this planet. Here is what that ratio looks like when you slow it down. The pyramids of Giza were built 4,500 years ago. Writing appeared roughly 5,000 years ago. Agriculture began perhaps 12,000 years ago. These feel ancient. They sit at the far edge of what most people consider history. But set against the full timeline of Homo sapiens, they are recent, astonishingly recent. If you compressed 300,000 years into a single 24-hour day, agriculture would begin at around 11:04 in the evening. Writing would appear at 11:36, the pyramids at roughly 11:38, and everything taught in a standard history course, every revolution, every war, every treaty and invention, would occupy the final 4 minutes before midnight. The other 23 hours and 56 minutes belong to people who left almost nothing behind. That is not a metaphor. It is arithmetic, and it carries a weight that is easy to state but difficult to absorb. For roughly 190,000 years after the Jebel Irhoud, people lived and died. Modern humans, anatomically indistinguishable from anyone alive today, produced no art that has survived, no jewellery, no carved symbols, no elaborate burials, no architecture beyond the simplest shelters. Their toolkit consisted of hand axes and simple flakes of stone designs so stable they persisted with barely any variation across thousands of generations. Archaeologists call this period the Long Stability, and it remains one of the deepest puzzles in the study of our species. The term itself suggests stagnation, a pause or a stretch of time where nothing happened. But that framing may say more about us, about what we choose to count as progress, than about the people who lived through it. These were not lesser humans. Their brains averaged around 1,350 cubic centimetres, well within the normal modern range. Their frontal lobes, the regions associated with planning language, abstract thought, were fully developed. They controlled fire. They hunted large animals across shifting landscapes. They survived environmental swings that would challenge any population on Earth today, adapting to forests, coastlines, savannas, and arid plateaus across the full breadth of Africa. Whatever they lacked, it was not intelligence and it was not physical capacity. What they did not leave or what did not survive is simply the kind of record we have learned to read. No painted walls, no shaped ivory, no beads strung on sinew, just stone-worked and reworked, functional and unchanged millennium after millennium. But silence in the archaeological record is not the same as silence in life, and this is a distinction worth pausing over. Stone endures. Bone sometimes endures. Ochre, under the right conditions, endures, but wood does not, leather does not, woven fibre does not, song does not. A story told beside a fire passed from one generation to the next for 10,000 years can vanish the moment the chain breaks, one drought, one famine, one season too harsh for the group that carried it. If those early humans painted on bark, carved in wood, decorated their skin, danced under open sky, we would have no way to know. The earth keeps what it keeps and discards the rest without apology. Some researchers estimate that the archaeological record may preserve less than 1% of early human material culture, which means we are not reading a book with missing pages, we are reading the binding and guessing at the chapters. This does not mean they were fully cultural in the way we might wish to imagine. It means we cannot be certain either way, and that ambiguity sits at the heart of everything that follows. The evidence permits silence. It also permits a richness we simply cannot see. What we can say with confidence is narrower than we might like for a span of time. Almost beyond comprehension, people who were us genetically, anatomically, neurologically us lived on this planet and left behind only the faintest physical trace, or their lives were real. Their survival was extraordinary. Their names, their languages, their understanding of the world they moved through, all of it is gone. Not destroyed, just never fixed in a medium that lasts. And then slowly, unevenly, something began to change, not everywhere at once, not in a flash. More like the first warmth of a season that hasn't quite arrived, felt in one valley, absent in the next. Faint, uncertain, easy to miss. The traces of that shift are what we follow now, the candle that kept going out. The shell is smaller than a thumbnail. It belongs to a species called Nassarius kraussianus, a marine snail found along the southern coast of Africa, and it has a hole punched through its centre, not by erosion, not by a predator's tooth, but by deliberate pressure applied from the inside outward. Under magnification, the edges of the perforation show wear patterns, consistent with being strung on a cord and rubbed repeatedly against other shells or against skin. It was found in Blombos Cave, a sandstone hollow carved into a cliff face, overlooking the Indian Ocean, about 300 kilometres east of Cape Town, buried in a deposit dated to roughly 75,000 years ago. Someone collected this shell, someone pierced it with care, someone wore it, and that small, almost invisible act, the decision to adorn the body with something that serves no survival function, is among the earliest signs we have that a human mind was doing something new. Blombos has produced more than just beads. In the same layers, archaeologists recovered pieces of red ochre iron oxide ground and smoothed with geometric patterns incised into their surfaces. Cross-hatched lines repeated at consistent intervals, carved with a pointed tool into the flat face of the pigment block. These are not random marks. The spacing is too regular, the repetition too deliberate. Someone sat in that cave or near it and made a pattern that had no function except to exist as a pattern. That is abstraction. That is symbolic thought, the capacity to create a mark that stands for something other than itself, or perhaps stands for nothing at all except the impulse to make order out of material. The ochre pieces from Blombos have been dated to approximately 100,000 years ago, making them among the oldest evidence of symbolic behaviour anywhere in the world. And yet the detail that haunts researchers is not what was found, but what comes next in the stratigraphy. The layer directly above the engraved ochre contains nothing of the kind. No patterns, no beads, no pigment blocks worked into deliberate shapes, just the familiar stone tools, functional, practical, undecorated, as though the impulse that produced those cross-hatched lines had simply stopped. The same discontinuity appears at other sites across southern and eastern Africa during this period. At Pinnacle Point further along the South African coast, evidence of ochre processing and shellfish harvesting appears around 164,000 years ago, suggesting a coastal adaptation that required planning knowledge of tidal cycles and possibly the controlled use of fire to open shells. But the cultural complexity visible at Pinnacle Point does not persist continuously. It surfaces, holds for a time, then fades from the record. At Deep Kloof rock shelter, fragments of ostrich eggshell engraved with hatched patterns have been recovered from layers dating to around 60,000 years ago. But again, the tradition does not carry forward in a straight line. It appears it flickers and then the record goes quiet. This pattern emergence followed by disappearance innovation, followed by apparent regression, is one of the most striking features of the Middle Stone Age archaeological record in Africa, and it resists simple explanation. If symbolic thought had been achieved, why would it not persist? If a group learned to make beads to engrave ochre, to process pigment for body decoration, why would the next generation not continue? The answer, or at least the most widely discussed framework for an answer, has to do with numbers. Human populations during this period were extraordinarily small. Genetic modelling suggests that the total number of Homo sapiens alive in Africa at various points during the Middle Stone Age may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals scattered across a continent of over 30 million square kilometres, divided into bands of perhaps 30 to 50 people, separated by hundreds of kilometres of terrain that was, for much of this period, drier and more hostile than it is today. In a population that small and that fragmented, knowledge is perishable in a way that is difficult for modern people to appreciate. If only one or two individuals in a band of 40 understand how to pierce a shell without shatterings, or how to grind ochre to a particular consistency and apply it to stone in lasting patterns, the death of those individuals through illness, through injury, through a single bad season means the death of the technique. There is no written manual. There is no neighbouring village to consult. There is only what the living remember, and memory in a small group is terrifyingly fragile. A skill that took generations to develop can vanish in a single year. Some researchers have modelled this process mathematically, demonstrating that cultural complexity in small isolated populations follows a pattern of random drift innovations, arise, persist for a time proportional to group size and connectivity, then disappear when the chain of transmission breaks. The flickering record at Blombos and Pinnacle Point and Deep Kloof may not reflect a species struggling to achieve modernity. It may reflect a species that achieved it repeatedly in scattered pockets only to lose it each time the population contracted, or the group that carried the knowledge failed to survive. Climate almost certainly played a role, though. Disentangling its effects from other variables is difficult. For much of the past 300,000 years, Africa experienced cycles of intense abrification periods. When the Sahara expanded southward, when lakes shrank to fractions of their former size, when the habitable zones compressed into isolated refugia along coastlines, river valleys and highland plateaus. During these contractions, human groups would have been pushed into smaller territories cut off from one another, forced into subsistence patterns that left little room for experimentation or cultural elaboration. When the climate improved, when rains returned, when grasslands expanded, when populations could grow and reconnect, the conditions for cultural transmission improved as well. Ideas could spread, techniques could be shared, Innovations that might have died in isolation could in a larger and more connected population take root and persist. The archaeological record may be showing us this oscillation culture expanding during favourable periods, contracting during harsh ones, never quite reaching the threshold of self-sustaining complexity. But there is a discomfort in this explanation, and it is worth naming honestly. These were modern brains, the same neural architecture that would eventually produce cave paintings, and bone flutes and carved ivory figurines was already present. The capacity for symbolic thought, for language, for planning across time, all of it was there. And yet for tens of thousands of years that capacity produced only intermittent flickers. Population size and climate pressure explain part of the pattern. They may not explain all of it. Something else may have been missing, something cognitive, something social, something in the structure of language or the organization of group life that had not yet reached a critical configuration. Or perhaps nothing was missing at all, and the record we have is simply too incomplete to show us what was really happening in those long quiet millennia between the ochre and the cave. What we can see is the flickering. What we cannot see is everything that burned, between the flickers, the conversations, the decisions, the moments of recognition, when one person showed another how to thread a cord through a shell and hang it around a neck. Those moments happened. The shells prove it. They just didn't last, or the people who carried them didn't last, or the world they lived in shifted beneath their feet before the flame could catch and hold. And then somewhere around 70,000 years ago it held. The door that opened once. What does it take to leave home when home is the only continent your species has ever known? Not home in the sense of a single valley or a familiar stretch of coast, but home as a biological fact, the landscape where every ancestor you have ever had was born, lived and died for 300,000 years. Around 70,000 years ago, a small number of humans walked out of Africa and into a world no member of their species had successfully inhabited before. They were not the first to try. Earlier groups had ventured beyond the continent's northeastern edge at least once, perhaps more than once, reaching the Levant, modern-day Israel and Lebanon, as early as 120,000 years ago. Archaeological sites in that region show stone tools, hearths, evidence of sustained occupation lasting thousands of years. And then the record goes blank. The populations vanished. Climate shifted, resources contracted, or the groups were simply too small to absorb the inevitable shocks of drought and disease and bad luck that erode any population living on the margins. But the wave that left around 70,000 years ago did not vanish. It kept going. Genetic evidence tells us this with a clarity that the archaeological record alone cannot match. Every human being alive today, outside of sub-Saharan Africa, descends from this single expansion, one founding population, one successful departure, one narrow thread of continuity, stretching from the Horn of Africa across the mouth of the Red Sea and into southern Arabia. The signature is written in mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed from mother to child, mutating at a roughly predictable rate that allows researchers to build lineage trees and estimate divergence times. The pattern is consistent across studies. All non-African populations share common ancestors who lived approximately 70,000 years ago, and the genetic diversity outside Africa is measurably lower than within it. That reduced diversity is the hallmark of a bottleneck, a moment when the breeding population shrank to a small number and then expanded rapidly, carrying only a fraction of the original genetic variation forward into new territories. How small was that founding group estimates vary, and the uncertainty is real, but most models place the number somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. That is not a migration in any organized sense. It is a slow generational drift, bands of 30 or 40 people following coastlines, tracking shellfish beds and river mouths, moving a few kilometers in a season, never aware that they are doing anything historic. The route most evidence supports runs south along the Arabian coast across the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, which during periods of lower sea level would have been partly exposed land, and onward along the shores of the Indian subcontinent towards Southeast Asia. The ocean was not a barrier, it was a highway. Coastal environments offered predictable food sources: fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine plants. A group that understood tidal patterns and knew how to process seafood could move enormous distances without ever needing to adapt to an entirely unfamiliar ecosystem. The coastline itself was the constant, the thread of familiarity running through an otherwise unknown world. The journey to Australia is where the story strains against what seems possible. Even with sea levels significantly lower than today, ice locked up vast quantities of water during this period, exposing land bridges and narrowing straits. There remained open water crossings of 60 to 90 kilometres between the islands of Southeast Asia and the Sahul continent, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea. You cannot see across 90 kilometres of open ocean. You cannot drift that distance on a log and arrive with a viable founding population. Someone built watercraft rafts boats, something capable of carrying people and supplies across miles of open sea, and someone made the decision to set out toward a horizon with no visible land beyond it. The earliest firm evidence of human presence in Australia dates to around 65,000 years ago, at a site called Madjed Bebe in the Northern Territory, where stone tools ground ochre and the remains of hearths were recovered from deposits sealed beneath layers of sand. That means within roughly 5,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had crossed the ocean and reached a new continent. The speed is extraordinary, and it suggests these were not random wanderings but purposeful movements, groups actively testing boundaries, reading currents, making choices that carried existential risk. The boats themselves have not survived. Wood and plant fibre decay and 65,000 years of tropical weathering leaves nothing for an archaeologist to recover. But the evidence of their existence is as solid as the continent they reached. You cannot arrive in Australia without crossing water, and you cannot cross that water without technology and intention. This is, in a quiet way, one of the most remarkable achievements in all of human history, and it happened tens of thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, before the first city, before anyone carved a single symbol into clay. It happened in the deep silence of prehistory, carried out by people whose names we will never know, whose languages left no trace, whose cultures vanished entirely except for the genetic echo they deposited in the populations that followed. Once in Australia, humans spread with startling speed. Within a few thousand years, they had reached the southern coast, crossed deserts, adapted to rainforests and arid scrublands, settled every habitable region of a continent that had evolved in biological isolation for millions of years. The animals they encountered, giant marsupials, enormous lizards, flightless birds weighing hundreds of kilograms, had never seen a predator like this. Many of those species went extinct within millennia of human arrival, though. Whether hunting, habitat modification, climate shifts, or some combination drove the disappearances remains actively debated. What is not debated is the pattern itself. Wherever humans arrived for the first time, the ecological landscape changed. It changed because humans change things. That has been true for at least 70,000 years, long before anyone planted a seed or built a wall. But the migration out of Africa was not a journey into emptiness. The world beyond the continent's borders was already occupied by other humans, ageless species, other minds shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution. And what happened when those groups met would leave marks that are still legible today, written not in stone or ochre, but in the structure of our DNA. The others who were already there, 2%. That is the number that collapsed a theory which had held for decades. Every person of European or Asian descent carries on average approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA, actual genetic sequences inherited from a species that diverged from our lineage roughly 500,000 years ago and went extinct around 40,000 years ago. The number is small enough to seem trivial, easy to dismiss as biological noise, except that it's not noise, it is signal. It appears consistently across populations, it correlates with identifiable phenotypic effects, and it could only have arrived in modern human genomes through one mechanism, interbreeding. When scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome in 2010, comparing it base pair by base pair against modern human DNA, the matches were unmistakable. Our ancestors did not simply encounter Neanderthals, they had children with them, and those children survived, reproduced, and passed their mixed inheritance forward across 2,000 generations to the present day. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of human expansion was replacement, sometimes called the out-of-Africa model, in its strictest form. Modern humans left Africa, spread across Eurasia, and outcompeted every other hominin species they encountered. Neanderthals disappeared, Denisovans disappeared, Homo erectus, if any lingering population still survived in remote corners of Asia, disappeared. The mechanism was assumed to be competition for resources, perhaps supplemented by direct conflict, but the outcome was understood as total one lineage replaced all others with no meaningful genetic exchange. It was a clean narrative, and it had the appeal of simplicity. It was also wrong, or at least incomplete in ways that fundamentally changed the story. The genetic evidence dismantled the replacement model not with a single dramatic finding, but with an accumulation of data points that taken together made the old framework untenable. Neanderthal DNA in European and Asian populations, Denisovan DNA up to 5% in Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, traces of archaic admixture in some African genomes that may represent interbreeding with yet unidentified hominin groups. The picture that emerged was not a single conquering lineage, but a braided stream, multiple populations meeting, mixing, separating and mixing again over tens of thousands of years. The Neanderthals themselves deserve more than the caricature that popular culture has assigned them. They occupied Europe and Western Asia for at least 200,000 years before modern humans arrived, surviving repeated glacial cycles that turned much of the continent into frozen steppe. Their bodies were adapted to cold, stockier builds, shorter limbs, greater muscle mass, all features that conserve heat in sub-zero environments. Their brains were as large as ours, in some cases larger, and the archaeological record shows a level of behavioural complexity that early researchers consistently underestimated. They made sophisticated stone tools requiring hundreds of precise strikes to shape. They controlled fire. They built shelters. They processed animal hides for clothing. They buried their dead, not always, not everywhere, but often enough that the practice appears intentional rather than accidental. At some sites they used pigments, perforated shells, and collected objects with no apparent utilitarian function. Whether these represent symbolic behaviour equivalent to what modern humans were producing at the same time remains debated, but the dismissal of Neanderthals as cognitively inferior has not survived contact with the evidence. The Denisovans are even harder to characterize because the fossil record is extraordinarily thin. A finger bone, a few teeth, a partial jawbone found in a cave on the Tibetan plateau. That is nearly all the physical evidence we have for an entire species or population or lineage, depending on which taxonomic framework you prefer, that ranged across an enormous territory from Siberia to Southeast Asia. What we know about them comes almost entirely from DNA extracted from those few fragments and compared against modern genomes. The results reveal a species that interbreed with modern humans on at least 2 separate occasions, contributing genes that in some cases proved remarkably useful. The most striking example involves a variant of the EPAS1 gene found in modern Tibetan populations which regulates hemoglobin production at high altitude, a critical adaptation for surviving above 4,000 meters, where oxygen levels drop to roughly 60% of sea level concentration. That gene did not evolve independently in the modern human lineage. It was inherited from Denisovans, acquired through interbreeding, and preserved by natural selection, because it solved a problem that would otherwise have been lethal. That single gene tells a story larger than itself. It suggests that interbreeding between species was not merely an incidental byproduct of proximity, but a mechanism through which modern humans acquired adaptive advantages they had not developed on their own. Neanderthal-derived genes in modern populations have been linked to immune system function, to skin and hair characteristics suited for northern latitudes, to aspects of fat metabolism that may have aided survival in cold environments. The exchange was not without cost. Some inherited variants are associated with increased risk of depression, blood clotting disorders, and type 2 diabetes, but the net effect was a genome enriched by contributions from multiple human lineages, each shaped by different selective pressures over hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution. And yet the interbreeding was limited. 2% Neanderthal, 5% Denisovan at the upper end. These populations lived alongside each other for thousands of years, overlapped in territory, shared resources, and still did not merge. The barriers were not primarily biological, though production of fertile offspring proves that, but cultural. Different languages, different traditions, different ways of making tools and organizing social life. Different identities, the same boundaries that separate human groups today: language, custom, belief. The quiet insistence on who is us and who is them were apparently powerful enough 70,000 years ago to limit gene flow between species that were in every physical sense close enough to create children together. The genetics record the contact. They also record the distance. But contact of any kind requires proximity, and proximity in Ice Age Eurasia meant sharing a world that was growing colder, harsher, and less forgiving with every passing millennium. What happened to the Neanderthals in that world and why modern humans survived it when they did not is a question that leads us deeper into the ice. The last of the others. The cold came in waves. Not a single freeze descending all at once, but a rhythm glaciers advancing, retreating, advancing again over tens of thousands of years, each cycle reshaping the landscape of Europe and Northern Asia in ways that forced every living thing to adapt or withdraw. Neanderthals had survived this rhythm for 200 millennia. They had watched ice sheets creep south across the plains of what is now Germany, and Poland watched forests shrink to scattered stands of birch and pine, watched the great herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros shift their ranges with the shifting grass. They knew cold the way a sailor knows the sea, not as an abstraction, but as the medium in which life was lived. Their bodies were built for it. Their tools were shaped by it. Their entire existence was a negotiation with winter conducted across more generations than any human culture that exists today can claim. And yet within roughly 10,000 years of modern humans arriving in Europe, the Neanderthals were gone. The timeline is not in dispute. Modern humans entered Europe around 45,000 years ago, moving northward from the Middle East along river valleys following the same game herds that Neanderthals had hunted for ages. Neanderthal populations began to contract shortly afterward, not everywhere simultaneously, but in a pattern that tracks broadly with the expanding presence of the newcomers. By 39,000 years ago, Neanderthals had disappeared from most of their former range. The last known population survived in pockets along the southern margins of the continent, the Iberian Peninsula, possibly the coastal caves of Gibraltar, clinging to the edges of a world that had once been entirely theirs. By roughly 40,000 years ago, perhaps slightly later, in the most isolated refugia, the species was extinct. 200,000 years of continuous presence on a continent ended in what amounts to a geological instant. Why? The question is simple. The answer is not. Direct conflict, organized violence between modern humans and Neanderthals is sometimes proposed, but poorly supported by the evidence. There are no mass graves, no weapon-scarred Neanderthal bones that unambiguously indicate warfare, no archaeological sites that look like battlefields. This does not mean violence never occurred. Small-scale skirmishes over territory or resources would leave little trace and are entirely plausible given what we know about how human groups interact under pressure. But genocide or anything resembling systematic extermination does not fit the record. The disappearance was slower than that, more diffuse, more like a tide going out than a wave crashing in. And tides are driven not by single forces, but by the accumulation of small persistent pressures that compound over time. Competition for resources is the most widely accepted framework, and it operates through arithmetic rather than aggression. Modern humans and Neanderthals hunted the same animals, used the same shelters, needed the same water sources. When two populations occupy the same ecological niche, even slight differences in efficiency produce divergent outcomes over generations. Modern humans appear to have had several marginal advantages, not dramatic superiority, but edges that mattered when multiplied across centuries. Their toolkit was more diverse, including longer-range projectile weapons like spear throwers that allowed hunting from a safer distance. Their social networks were larger and more geographically extended. Evidence from traded materials, or seashells found hundreds of kilometers from the coast, flint sourced from distant quarries, suggests that modern human groups maintained relationships across far greater distances than Neanderthals typically did. Larger networks mean faster spread of innovations, better buffering against local resource failures, and access to a wider pool of mates and allies during times of stress. Population size amplified every advantage. Modern humans, drawing on the demographic momentum of their expansion out of Africa, likely outnumbered Neanderthals significantly, perhaps by a factor of 10 to 1 across the continent as a whole. Neanderthal populations were probably never large. Genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains reveals low diversity consistent with small isolated groups prone to inbreeding. Total numbers across their entire European and Western Asian range may have been as low as 10,000 to 50,000 individuals at any given time. Modern humans numbered in the hundreds of thousands and were growing. When both groups faced the same climatic stress and around 40,000 years ago, temperatures fluctuated sharply, ecosystems shifted. Ice advanced and retreated unpredictably. The larger population recovered faster. Bands that failed were replaced by neighbouring bands. Territories abandoned during harsh periods were reoccupied when conditions improved. For Neanderthals, with smaller populations, less genetic diversity, and more limited social networks, each contraction was harder to reverse. Each loss of territory was more likely to be permanent. The decline was probably invisible to anyone living through it. No Neanderthal woke one morning to the realm of the realization that their species was ending. The process played out over hundreds of generations, groups growing smaller, becoming more isolated, losing contact with other groups, losing the genetic diversity and cultural complexity that had sustained them for millennia. Inbreeding increased. Infant mortality likely rose. Territories shrank to fragments. The last Neanderthals may not have known they were the last. They were simply people living in the places they had always lived, doing what their ancestors had done, unaware that the mathematics of competition had already written an outcome they could not escape. Somewhere, perhaps in a limestone cave overlooking the Mediterranean, perhaps on a windswept cliff in Gibraltar, where Neanderthal hearths have been dated to as recently as around 40,000 years ago, the final individual of a 200,000-year lineage died. No one recorded it. No monument marks the place. The species that had survived ice ages and megafauna and 200 millennia of the harshest conditions Europe could offer ended not with a catastrophe but with a quiet arithmetic of diminishing returns, and yet they did not disappear entirely. That 2% remains Neanderthal DNA, woven into the genomes of billions of living people, functional sequences affecting immune response, skin pigmentation, pain sensitivity, the shape of the skull. In a sense, the Neanderthals were not replaced. They were absorbed, folded into a lineage that outlived them, carried forward in fragments through every generation since. The species is extinct. The genes are not. It is a strange form of survival, not the kind that preserves a name or a culture or a memory, but the kind that persists in the silent machinery of cells doing its work without recognition, without awareness, without end. The world the Neanderthals left behind was entering its harshest phase. The ice was thickening. The glaciers were advancing southward again. And the modern humans who now had Europe to themselves would need every advantage, every tool, every technique, every spark of ingenuity to survive what was coming, what we might be getting wrong. It is worth pausing here to ask an uncomfortable question not about the past, but about the story we are telling about it. Every narrative carries assumptions, and the narrative of human prehistory carries more than most because the evidence is so thin and the gap so wide that the shape of the story depends heavily on which pieces you choose to emphasize and which you set aside. The framework that has dominated for decades a long period of cognitive silence followed by a sudden creative explosion is compelling. It is also, some researchers argue, misleading in ways that may distort our understanding of what actually happened during those deep millennia before the archaeological record lights up with art and ornament and symbolic complexity. The discomfort is not that the framework is wrong, it is that we cannot be sure it is right, and the consequences of the uncertainty run deeper than they might first appear. The first problem is geographic. The concept of a Great Leap Forward or Upper Paleolithic Revolution was built primarily on European evidence, cave paintings in France and Spain, carved ivory in Germany, elaborate burials across Central and Western Europe. Europe has an abundance of limestone caves, and caves are extraordinary preservers of organic material. Paintings on cave walls survive for tens of thousands of years in conditions that would destroy the same images on an exposed rock face within centuries. Carved bone and ivory sealed in cool dry sediment persist where they would decay rapidly in tropical soil. The density of spectacular finds in Europe is real, but it may reflect the density of preservation conditions rather than the density of creative activity. Africa, where modern humans lived for 200,000 years before anyone reached Europe, has far fewer deep limestone caves, far more acidic soils, far harsher conditions for the survival of organic artifacts. If the earliest art was painted on wood, on bark, on an animal hide, on the human body itself, it would have vanished entirely in African conditions, while its European equivalents created tens of thousands of years later survived by geological accident. Some researchers have argued that the explosion of creativity visible in the European Upper Paleolithic is not a true beginning, but a late and geographically biased sample of a tradition that had been developing in Africa for far longer, perhaps continuously, perhaps in the same flickering pattern we see at Blombos and Diepkloof, but at a scale and duration that the African archaeological record is simply too fragmentary to capture. The second problem is conceptual, and it touches the long stability itself. When we describe 190,000 years as a period of stasis, of nothing happening, we are defining something happening in a very specific way. We mean symbolic artifacts. We mean objects that survive. We mean the kind of material culture that an archaeologist can dig up, photograph and publish. But human life is not composed primarily of durable objects. It is composed of relationships, decisions, knowledge transmitted through speech and gesture, emotional bonds, spiritual practice and ways of understanding the natural world that may have been extraordinarily sophisticated without ever producing a single artifact that lasts. The San people of southern Africa, whose genetic lineage is among the oldest continuous lineages on Earth, maintained complex cosmologies, detailed ecological knowledge and rich artistic traditions for thousands of years, almost entirely through oral transmission and ephemeral media like body paint and sand drawings. Had their culture existed only in the archaeological record without living descendants to explain it, we would see almost nothing. A few stone tools, some ochre residue, perhaps a handful of ostrich eggshell fragments. We would call it silence. We would be wrong. This does not mean the long stability was secretly a golden age of hidden cultural achievement. The argument from absence can be pushed too far in either direction. It is as unwarranted to assume rich culture behind every gap in the record as it is to assume emptiness. What the skeptic's position demands is not a reversal of the narrative, but a recalibration of confidence. We should hold our conclusions more loosely than we typically do. The statement nothing happened for 190,000 years is not a fact. It is an interpretation of an incomplete record offered with more certainty than the evidence supports. The honest statement is narrower for 190,000 years. Almost nothing happened that left a trace in the specific types of deposits we have learned to excavate and analyze. The difference between those two sentences is the space in which entire cultures, entire ways of being human, may have existed and vanished without a whisper. The third problem concerns the migration narrative. The model of a single founding population leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago and seeding all non-African humanity is elegant and well supported by mitochondrial DNA analysis. But recent genomic studies have introduced complications. Some researchers have identified traces of earlier modern human DNA in populations that should not carry them. If the single-wave model is strictly correct, faint signals suggesting that earlier dispersals previously assumed to have failed completely may have contributed small but detectable amounts of genetic material to later populations. The picture emerging from high-resolution genomic analysis is not a single arrow pointing out of Africa, but something messier, more braided, with multiple movements across porous boundaries over tens of thousands of years. The single-wave model may still describe the dominant pattern, but dominant and only are different words, and the distinction matters when you are trying to reconstruct the movements of a species across 250,000 years, with evidence drawn from a few hundred ancient genomes and a scattered handful of archaeological sites. None of this invalidates the broad outline of the story. Modern humans evolved in Africa. They developed symbolic thought. They left the continent. They encountered and interbred with other human species. They spread across the globe. These things happened. The evidence for them is strong and converging from multiple independent lines of inquiry. What the skeptic's lens reveals is not a different story, but the same story told with appropriate humility and acknowledgement that the gaps in what we know are not empty spaces waiting to be filled with our preferred narratives, but real absences that may contain surprises we have not yet imagined. The pattern of human emergence remains visible. It simply has more room inside it than we sometimes allow. And it is into that room, into the cold, the darkness, and the long millennia of ice that the story now moves. Living inside the cold. In the winter of 1965, a Ukrainian farmer digging a storage cellar in the village of Mezhizhirish, about 15 kilometers south of Kanev on the Dnieper River, struck something hard with his shovel at a depth of roughly 2 meters. It was not rock. It was bone enormous, curved, unmistakably mammoth. Excavation over the following years revealed 4 structures built entirely from the skeletal remains of woolly mammoths, long bones stacked in interlocking patterns to form walls, jawbones arranged in rows like brickwork skulls placed at the base for stability. Each structure used the remains of an estimated 30 to 40 individual animals. The interiors showed evidence of hearths, ash deposits, and accumulations of flint debitage, the small sharp flakes left behind when stone tools are shaped. Someone had lived here inside houses made from the bones of giants on the frozen steppe of Eastern Europe approximately 15,000 years ago. One mammoth skull had been buried upside down near the entrance of a hut, its purpose unknown, ritual, structural, decorative, or something that does not fit neatly into any category we have names for. Mezhizhirish is not unique. Similar mammoth bone structures have been found at more than a dozen sites across Ukraine and Western Russia, spanning a period from roughly 25,000 to 12,000 years ago. The deep heart of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets a mile thick, covered much of northern Europe, and the average temperature across the continent was perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius colder than today. This was not a mild chill. It was a reconfiguration of the world. Forests retreated to scattered refugia in southern Europe. Open steppe and tundra stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains, a vast treeless grassland grazed by herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, horse, and reindeer. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters as water locked into continental ice sheets, exposing enormous areas of continental shelf. You could walk from France to England, from Siberia to Alaska, from mainland Southeast Asia to Borneo. The coastlines that modern humans had followed out of Africa were now miles inland from the actual water's edge, buried beneath sediment that would not be submerged again for thousands of years. Living in this world required a kind of ingenuity that leaves its traces scattered across the archaeological record in fragments that taken individually seem modest, but collectively describe a revolution in how humans related to their environment. The toolkit changed. The heavy general-purpose hand axes that had served for hundreds of thousands of years gave way to a diversified array of specialized instruments. Long thin blades struck from prepared stone cores, bone points shaped for hafting onto wooden shafts, fine-eyed needles carved from slivers of bone or ivory, with perforations so small they could only have been drilled with a rotary tool of some kind. The needles are particularly telling because needles mean sewing, and sewing means fitted clothing garments shaped to the body rather than draped loosely over it. In temperatures that could drop below minus 30 Celsius on a winter night, the difference between a draped hide and a tailored parka is the difference between survival and death. Someone figured this out, someone taught it to the next generation, and the technique persisted, refined, and adapted across millennia of deepening cold. Hunting strategies grew more sophisticated as well. The atlatel, a spear thrower consisting of a short shaft with a hooked end that effectively extends the length of the thrower's arm, appeared during this period, allowing hunters to launch projectiles with greater force and accuracy from a safer distance. Some sites show evidence of communal hunting on a scale that implies coordinated planning bison driven into narrow valleys where they could be killed in quantity, reindeer herds intercepted at predictable river crossings during seasonal migrations. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a site occupied around 27,000 years ago at the edge of the ice, archaeologists found not only the expected stone tools and animal bones, but something unexpected: dozens of small clay figurines, some depicting animals, some depicting women, fired in kilns at temperatures high enough to harden them permanently. These are among the oldest known ceramics in the world, and they were not made for storage or cooking. They were made to be held, to be looked at, perhaps to be given or exchanged or placed in specific locations for reasons that the objects themselves do not explain. Dolní Věstonice also yielded burials. One grave contained a young man with a pronounced spinal deformity, interred with evident care, positioned deliberately, accompanied by objects treated in death with the same attention given to any other member of the group. That detail is small, easily overlooked in a catalogue of stone tools and faunal remains, but it carries weight. A person with a severe physical disability survived to adulthood in an Ice Age hunting society, which means the group supported him, fed him, included him in the life of the community despite his inability to participate fully in the physically demanding work of hunting and migration. That is not mere survival, that is a social choice, a decision about who matters and why, made by people living under conditions of genuine scarcity in a world where every calorie counted and every mouth required justification. Trade networks during this period extended over distances that seem improbable given the terrain and climate. Mediterranean seashells have been recovered from sites in southern Germany, amber from the Baltic coast has turned up in France, and high-quality flint from specific geological sources has been found at sites hundreds of kilometers from its origin. These materials did not travel by themselves. Someone carried them, or they passed through a chain of hands group to group, valley to valley, along routes that connected communities separated by weeks of travel across frozen steppe. The existence of these networks implies not only physical movement but social infrastructure relationships maintained. Across distance agreements about exchange, a degree of trust between groups that had no kinship ties and may have spoken different languages. The Ice Age did not merely test human endurance. It forced a kind of creativity that operates under constraint, the ingenuity of people who cannot afford to fail, who must solve every problem with the materials at hand, who must plan not for tomorrow but for a winter that lasts 6 months and a landscape that offers no second chances. What emerged from that pressure was not just survival but culture in its fullest sense, art, music, social complexity, networks of exchange, care for the vulnerable, and a relationship with the material world that went far beyond the functional. The ice demanded everything, and the people who lived inside it gave back something that the ice, for all its power, could not produce on its own. Deep inside the frozen world, in the darkest places, they could find those same people were doing something stranger still. They were painting. Fire carried into the dark. A handprint rests in red ochre against limestone 30,000 years old. The fingers are slightly spread, the thumb angled naturally, the palm flat against the cold surface of the rock. Around the hand, a halo of blown pigment. Someone placed their mouth to a hollow bone or reed, filled it with powdered iron. Oxide mixed with saliva or water, and blew a fine mist across their own hand onto the wall. When the hand was removed, its silhouette remained a negative image, precise and unmistakable, the signature of a specific individual whose name, whose face, whose language, whose entire life has been erased by time. But the hand remains. You could place your own hand over it today in the deep silence of a French cave, and your fingers would align with theirs almost perfectly. 30,000 years collapse into the width of a palm. The gesture is so simple it barely qualifies as art, and yet it is among the most powerful images humans have ever made, because it says the only thing that ultimately matters: I was here, the caves where these images survive. Lascaux Chauvet, Altamira, Cosca Pec, Merle, and dozens of others, scattered across southern France and northern Spain, are not places where people lived. They are deep, dark, difficult to reach. Some require crawling through narrow passages on hands and knees. Others involve descending vertical shafts or wading through underground streams. No natural light penetrates to the chambers where the paintings are found. Whoever made them worked by the glow of animal fat lamps or small fires carried into the darkness, their light casting shifting shadows across walls that curve and bulge with the natural contours of the rock. The effort required to reach these places, to carry materials and fuel into them, to work for hours in flickering half-light, all of it argues against casual decoration. These were not doodles, they were not idle experiments. The difficulty of the location was part of the point, though. What exactly the point was remains one of the most debated questions in the study of human prehistory. The paintings themselves are not what most people expect. They are not crude, not tentative, not the fumbling first attempts of a species learning to represent the world. The animals at Chauvet lions, horses, rhinoceroses, bison, are rendered with a sophistication that would be remarkable in any era. The artists understood anatomy, understood how muscle moves beneath skin, understood how to suggest motion through the positioning of legs and the tilt of a head. They used the natural topology of the cave walls to enhance three-dimensionality, turning a bulge in the rock into a bison's shoulder, a depression into the curve of a horse's belly. They layered pigments, charcoal black, ochre, red manganese brown to create depth and shading. At Chauvet, a panel of lions shows dozens of overlapping figures flowing around the curve of the wall, their bodies merging and separating like a pride moving through tall grass. The composition is not accidental. It is designed considered the product of someone who understood not only how to depict an animal, but how to arrange multiple animals in a visual field to create rhythm and movement and emotional impact. These are the oldest known paintings in Europe, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, and they are among the finest. That paradox, the earliest being among the best, has troubled researchers for decades, because it implies that the tradition visible at Chauvet was already mature. There must have been earlier stages, simpler experiments, a learning period, during which techniques were developed and refined. But those earlier stages have not been found, or they were created on materials that did not survive. The subjects chosen for depiction follow patterns that are themselves suggestive. Large herbivores dominate horses, bison, oryx, mammoths. Predators appear, but less frequently lions, bears, hyenas. Reindeer, despite being the most commonly hunted animal across Ice Age Europe, based on faunal remains at occupation sites, are strangely rare in cave art. Fish and birds, both important food sources, are nearly absent. Humans appear only occasionally, and when they do, they are often distorted, part human, part animal, with bird heads or hooved feet or bodies that seem to be caught mid-transformation between species. One famous image at Lascaux shows a figure with a bird-like head lying beside a wounded bison, a spear nearby, a bird perched on a stick. The scene resists interpretation. A hunting accident, a ritual, a myth, a dream. The story that gave it meaning is gone. Only the image persists, carrying a weight of significance that we can feel but cannot decode. Why caves? Why the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible chambers? The theories are numerous, and none is fully satisfying. Some archaeologists propose that the caves functioned as ritual spaces, sanctuaries where initiates were brought into contact with sacred images as part of coming-of-age ceremonies or spiritual practices. The darkness, the difficulty of access, the disorienting effect of moving through narrow passages by firelight, all of these would heighten the psychological impact of encountering the paintings. Others suggest a connection to acoustics. Some painted chambers have unusual resonant properties, and the placement of images sometimes correlates with areas where sound behaves strangely echoing or amplifying in ways that might have been interpreted as supernatural. Still others argue more pragmatically that caves were chosen simply because they preserved paintings that the artists understood or discovered by accident, that images placed deep underground lasted longer than those exposed to weather and light. The preservation argument is logical, but does not explain why some paintings are located in spaces so cramped that only one person at a time could view them, or why certain chambers show evidence of repeated visits and new additions over thousands of years, while nearby surfaces of equal quality were left blank. What seems clear is that these spaces mattered. They were returned to across generations, treated with a consistency that implies shared understanding and transmitted knowledge. The location of the caves, the techniques for reaching the painting chambers, the methods for preparing pigments, the conventions governing which animals were depicted and how. That continuity maintained across millennia in the absence of any written record speaks to a depth of cultural transmission that is itself a kind of monument invisible but enduring, passed from teacher to student in the same darkness where the paintings watched from the walls. The caves held images. But outside them, in the open air of the Ice Age world, people were carrying other kinds of meaning, smaller, portable, pressed into shapes that could travel with the band as it moved across the steppe. Things meant to be carried. Why would someone spend hundreds of hours carving an object that cannot cut, cannot scrape, cannot be hafted to a spear or used to process a hide? An object whose only function, as far as we can determine, is to exist as a particular shape. The question is worth sitting with because the answer, whatever it is, marks a boundary in the story of our species. On one side of that boundary, every object humans met served a practical purpose. On the other side, people began investing enormous skill and time into creating things that served no survival function at all, things that meant something, communicated something, held value. Not because of what they could do, but because of what they represented. The oldest known example of this kind of object is the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, recovered from a cave in the Swabian Alps of southwestern Germany in 1939, though its significance was not fully recognized until the fragments were reassembled decades later. It stands roughly 30 centimeters tall, carved from a single piece of mammoth ivory, and it depicts a figure that does not exist in nature, a human body with the head of a cave lion. The carving is approximately 40,000 years old. Experimental reconstructions suggest it required at least 400 hours of skilled work to produce weeks of sustained effort by someone who understood both the material and the form they were trying to release from it. 400 hours is not a casual investment. It is a commitment that implies not only individual skill, but social support. Someone fed and sheltered the carver. During those weeks, someone agreed that the work was worth doing. Someone valued the finished object enough to keep it, carry it, perhaps pass it from hand to hand across years or generations. The Lion Man is not a tool. It is not a weapon. It is an act of imagination made physical, a combination of two concepts, human and lion, that exists nowhere except in the mind of the person who conceived it, and the hands of the person who carved it. That capacity to merge categories to create something that has never been seen by combining elements of things that have, is what cognitive scientists call combinatorial creativity, and it is one of the defining features of the modern human mind. The Lion Man is evidence that this capacity was fully operational 40,000 years ago, deployed not for survival, but for meaning. It was not alone. Across the same region of southwestern Germany, in caves within a few dozen kilometers of Hohenstein-Stadel, archaeologists have recovered a concentration of carved ivory objects that together constitute one of the densest clusters of early art found anywhere in the world. Small figurines of horses, mammoths, bison and waterfowl, each carved with attention to anatomical accuracy and proportion, each small enough to hold in one hand or carry in a pouch. And among them, objects of a different kind, entirely flutes. At Hohlefels, a cave near the town of Schelklingen, a flute carved from the radius bone of a griffon vulture was found in deposits dated to approximately 43,000 years ago. It has 5 finger holes carefully spaced and drilled with precision, and when reconstructed and played by modern musicians, it produces a clear pentatonic scale. 5 distinct tones arranged in intervals that are recognizable, even pleasing to a modern ear. Someone made music in that cave or carried the instrument out onto the steppe and played beneath an open sky. Producing sounds that had no function except to be heard, to be felt, to create an experience that exists only in the moment of its making, and then vanishes, leaving behind nothing but the hollow bone that made it possible. The Venus figurines pose a different set of questions. Hundreds of these small sculptures have been found across a geographic range stretching from southwestern France to the plains of central Russia, spanning a period from roughly 35,000 to 11,000 years ago. They depict female forms, typically emphasizing breasts, hips, and abdomen, while minimizing or entirely omitting facial features, hands and feet. Some are carved from ivory or soft stone. Others, like those found at Dolní Věstonice, are modelled from clay and fired in kilns, making them among the earliest ceramic objects in the archaeological record. The consistency of the form across such vast distances and long time spans is striking, and it resists easy explanation. These were not portraits in any conventional sense. The absence of individual facial features suggests they were not meant to represent specific people. Fertility symbols is the most common interpretation, representations of pregnancy of the female body's capacity to create life, perhaps invested with protective or spiritual power. But the interpretation is speculative, and the figurines themselves offer no confirmation. They were clearly important. People made them with care, kept them, sometimes buried them with the dead, carried them across landscapes that took weeks to traverse. Their meaning was real. It is simply no longer accessible to us, locked behind the silence of a culture that communicated its deepest values through forms we can see but cannot read. Jewelry tells a related story, though in a different register. Beads made from shells, from pierced animal teeth, from carved segments of ivory and bone appear across Ice Age sites in quantities that imply sustained production. Not one person making a single necklace, but communities producing personal ornaments as a regular part of material culture. Some beads are astonishingly small, less than a centimetre in diameter, with perforations drilled through their centres so precisely that a single miscalculation would shatter the piece. The time investment is significant. The function is not practical. One survives winter because they are wearing a necklace of fox teeth. But someone survives as a social being recognized, identified, buried, located within a web of relationships and meanings because the ornaments they wear communicate things that words alone may not. Status, perhaps. Group membership, skill, beauty, the desire to be seen as a particular kind of person, to project identity outward through the body's surface. That impulse is so deeply human that it barely requires explanation. What requires explanation is only why it took so long to become visible in the archaeological record, or whether it was always there expressed through media, that simply did not last. Taken together, the carvings, the flutes, the figurines, the beads, these objects describe a world in which survival was necessary but not sufficient. People who lived under conditions of genuine physical hardship, who faced cold and scarcity and danger on a daily basis, nevertheless devoted significant time and resources to making things that served no function except to carry meaning. That choice tells us something about the architecture of the human mind that no amount of a brain size measurement or genetic analysis can capture. It tells us that meaning is not a luxury. It is a need as fundamental in its way as food or shelter, and the people of the Ice Age understood this as clearly as anyone who has lived since. But the Ice Age would not last. The glaciers that had defined the world for tens of thousands of years were beginning almost imperceptibly to retreat, and the world that emerged from beneath the ice would demand an entirely different kind of human response, the invention that changed everything and nothing. 12,000 years ago, a single grain of wheat could not survive without human hands. Wild emmer wheat, the ancestor of the crop that would eventually feed civilizations, disperses its seeds by shattering the brittle rachis, snapping at maturity to scatter grains across the ground where wind and rain carry them to new soil. It is an elegant survival strategy refined over millions of years of evolution, but at some point in the hills of the Fertile Crescent, in the arc of land stretching from modern-day Israel through Syria and into southeastern Turkey, people began harvesting wild grains with stone sickles, and in doing so they inadvertently selected for a mutation that would have been fatal in the wild, a tough rachis that held its seeds instead of releasing them. Plants with this trait were easier to harvest. The grains stayed on the stalk until a human hand stripped them away, and so their seeds were disproportionately collected, stored and replanted. Over hundreds of years, without anyone understanding the mechanism, humans bred a plant that could no longer reproduce without them. The wheat became dependent on people, and people slowly and irrevocably became dependent on the wheat. This was not a decision anyone made. It was not a moment of inspiration or a deliberate act of invention. It was a drift, a gradual entanglement between a species and a grass that deepened with each generation until neither could easily disengage from the other. The process that archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, unfolded over thousands of years, not decades, and it carried none of the drama that the word revolution implies. People did not wake up one morning and decide to become farmers. They made small adjustments, scattering seeds near a seasonal camp, returning to the same patch of wild grain year after year, clearing competing vegetation to give preferred plants more space, and each adjustment pulled them a little further from the mobility that had defined human life for 300,000 years. The accumulation of smaller changes produced a transformation so profound that the world before it and the world after it are barely recognizable as the same species experience, yet the people living through it almost certainly did not perceive themselves as participants in a revolution. They were simply doing what worked season by season, generation by generation, until the sum of those small practical choices became irreversible. The earliest firm evidence of cultivated crops appears in the Levant around 12,000 years ago, at sites scattered across the Jordan Valley and the foothills of the Taurus and Zagros Mountains. Wheat and barley were the primary grains. Lentils, peas and chickpeas followed. Animal domestication moved in parallel. Sheep and goats, first selected from wild populations for docility and manageable size, penned and bred over to generations until their behavior and physiology diverged measurably from their wild ancestors. Cattle and pigs came later, requiring more space and more sophisticated management. Dogs almost certainly came earliest of all, perhaps 15,000 years ago or more, their domestication predating agriculture by millennia. A partnership forged not in fields but on the hunt, in the shared warmth of a fire, in the mutual recognition that two species could benefit from proximity. But it was the combination of plant cultivation and animal husbandry that created the conditions for what followed, because together they produced something that hunting and gathering rarely could surplus. More food than a single family needed for immediate consumption. Food that could be stored, measured, accumulated, and critically controlled. Surplus changed everything. It changed the relationship between people and land, because fields require tending and tending requires staying. The seasonal mobility that had characterized human life since the species began gave way to permanent settlement. Mud, brick houses, storage pits, boundary walls, the physical infrastructure of staying put. At Jericho in the Jordan Valley, a settlement grew around a perennial spring more than 10,000 years ago, accumulating layers of occupation that eventually formed a mound of tell rising above the surrounding plain. Stone walls encircled the settlement. A tower roughly 8 meters tall stood at its center, built from undressed stone with an internal staircase. One of the oldest monumental structures known. Its purpose still debated, perhaps defensive, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps simply a statement of collective capability, a way of saying we are here and we intend to remain. Hundreds of people lived at Jericho year-round, growing barley, and wheat-keeping goats, grinding grain on heavy stone querns that wore grooves into their surfaces with years of daily use. This was new. Not the intelligence, not the social cooperation those had been present for tens of thousands of years, but the permanence, the commitment to a single place, the accumulation of material culture in layers that would grow deeper with every generation. Surplus also changed the relationship between people and each other, and this change was not uniformly benign. When food can be stored, it can be hoarded. When land produces value, it becomes property. When property exists, it must be defended, and disputes over its boundaries must be adjudicated. The egalitarian social structures that characterized most hunter-gatherer societies, fluid, flexible, resistant to the concentration of power in any single individual, began to give way to something more stratified. Some families accumulated more grain, more livestock, more land. Leaders emerged, individuals who organized collective labor, managed irrigation, mediated conflict, and in doing so accrued authority that could be transmitted to their children. The seeds of inequality were planted alongside the seeds of wheat, and they grew in the same soil, nourished by the same surplus, producing a harvest that would shape the next 10,000 years of human experience in ways that the first farmers could not have anticipated and might not have welcomed. Skeletons from early agricultural sites tell a story that complicates the narrative of progress. Compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors, early farmers were shorter, showed more signs of nutritional deficiency, suffered higher rates of dental disease from grain-heavy diets, and bore skeletal markers of repetitive physical stress. The grinding of grain, the hoeing of fields, the daily labor of an existence that was by many physical measures harder than the life it replaced. Infectious disease increased as well, an inevitable consequence of living in close quarters with domesticated animals whose pathogens, measles, influenza, smallpox, tuberculosis, crossed the species barrier and found in dense human settlements the perfect conditions for transmission. Farming did not make life easier. It made life different, and it made more life possible, which is not the same thing. But the current had turned, and it would not turn back. The villages that farming built would grow into towns, the towns into something larger, denser, more complex, more dependent on systems of organization that no single mind could hold. The world was thickening with people, and people pressed together in numbers that had never existed before would need new ways to remember, to coordinate, and to keep track of what belonged to whom. The weight of memory. Around 3200 BCE, in a storage room attached to a temple complex in the city of Uruk in what is now southern Iraq, someone pressed the blunt end of a reed into a lump of wet clay and made a mark. Then another. Then a row of them, small wedge-shaped impressions arranged in columns, each one representing a quantity. 5 jars of barley, 3 units of labor, a debt owed or a debt paid. The tablet was roughly the size of a human palm, and when it dried it became hard enough to survive 5,000 years of burial beneath river silt, collapsed walls, and centuries of accumulated dust. It was not a poem, it was not a prayer. It was a receipt, and it is among the oldest known examples of writing in the world, the beginning of a technology that would over the following millennia remake the relationship between human beings and time itself. The invention of writing did not emerge from a desire to record stories or preserve wisdom. It emerged from the administrative demands of a city that had grown too large and too complex for any individual memory to manage. Uruk by the late 4th millennium BCE was home to perhaps 40,000 people, a population density that had no precedent in human experience. The temple complexes at its centre functioned not only as religious institutions but as economic engines collecting agricultural surplus from surrounding farmland, redistributing rations to workers, managing herds, coordinating labour for irrigation projects and construction. The volume of transactions exceeded what could be reliably tracked through oral agreements and personal recollection. Someone needed to know how much grain was in storage. Someone needed to verify that the correct amount had been distributed. Someone needed a record that existed outside the fallibility of human memory, that could be checked, referenced, and held up as evidence in the event of a dispute. Writing was not born from inspiration or voice. It was born from necessity, the necessity of managing Sapua in a society where surplus had become the foundation of power. The earliest script, which scholars call proto-cuneiform, was not a language in the way we understand the term. It was a system of signs, pictographic at first, then increasingly abstract, that represented objects, quantities, and transactions. A stylized image of a head meant person. A series of impressed circles meant a number. Combined, they could record that a certain number of people had received a certain quantity of goods. Over centuries, the system evolved signs, multiplied, and the script began to capture not just nouns and numbers, but verbs, adjectives, grammatical structures, the full complexity of spoken language rendered in marks on clay. By the time the script reached the stage known as cuneiform proper, it could express anything a human being could say. Myths, laws, letters, prayers, insults, jokes, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, all of it could be fixed in clay and stored, copied, transmitted across distances, and preserved across generations. The technology that began as a grain-counting mechanism became within a few centuries a medium for the full range of human thought. The consequences were enormous, and they unfolded in directions that the temple accountants of Uruk could not have foreseen. Writing created a new kind of memory, external, durable, independent of any individual mind. Before writing everything, a society knew existed only in the heads of its living members. When an elder died, their knowledge died with them, unless it had been successfully transmitted to someone younger, through speech demonstration and repetition. Oral transmission is flexible, adaptive, capable of carrying extraordinary amounts of information across generations, but it is also vulnerable to disruption, distortion, and loss. A single bad generation, a single break in the chain of teachers and students, and an entire tradition can vanish. Writing changed the equation. A law inscribed on a clay tablet does not forget. A list of kings carved into a stone monument does not drift with retelling. A mathematical formula copied from one tablet to another arrives intact, unchanged, available to anyone who can read the script, whether they live in the same city as the author or in a different city 1,000 years later. Memory for the first time could outlive the person who held it. But writing also introduced a filter that would shape everything we know about the past from this point forward, and the filter is worth examining honestly. The people who could write were few, a specialized class of scribes trained in temple schools spending years mastering the hundreds of signs required for competent composition. The things that got written down were overwhelmingly the things that mattered to the institutions that employed those scribes' inventories as tax records, royal decrees, religious texts, diplomatic correspondence. The daily lives of ordinary people, farmers, potters, weavers, children, the vast majority of any ancient city's population almost never appear in the written record, except as anonymous entries in accounting ledgers. 10 units of labour, 40 measures of grain delivered. Names when they appear belong to kings and priests and officials. The texture of everyday existence, what people ate for dinner, what songs they sang while working, what stories they told their children at bedtime, what they feared in the dark. Almost none of that was considered worth the effort and expense of inscription. Writing saves memory, but only the memory that someone with access to the technology considered worth saving. Everything else continues to rely on the older, more fragile mechanisms of oral transmission and material culture, and most of it inevitably is lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in Uruk, copied and recopied across Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, survived because the scribes valued it, because institutions preserved it, because clay is durable and Mesopotamian soil is dry. It tells the story of a king who seeks immortality and fails, who learns that the only permanence available to mortals is the permanence of what they build and what they leave behind. The irony is precise. The poem survived. The poet did not. We do not know who composed it. We do not know what they looked like, how they spoke, whether they were celebrated or obscure in their own time. The work endures. The person behind it has vanished as completely as any anonymous hunter who chipped a hand axe on an African plain 200,000 years earlier. Writing extended the reach of memory, but it did not eliminate the fundamental condition of human existence that most of what we are, most of what we do, most of what we feel and think and dream, passes through the world without leaving a mark. And it is that condition, the vastness of what is lost beside the smallness of what remains, that gives the surviving fragments their weight. Not because they tell the whole story, because they remind us that there was a whole story and that we will never hear most of it. What the silence holds. We began with a piece of ochre in a cave on the southern coast of Africa, carved with lines that someone made on purpose 100,000 years ago. We followed the thread from there through the long silence of the Middle Stone Age, through the migration that carried a small founding population out of Africa and across the planet, through the encounter with other human species, whose genes still circulate in living bodies, through the deep cold of the Ice Age and the art that emerged from its darkness, through the slow entanglement with wheat and goats and fixed settlements that remade the human relationship with land and time, through the invention of writing that gave memory a form that could outlast the mind that held it. Each step in that sequence is supported by evidence, bones, tools, pigments, genes, clay tablets, pressed with reed marks 5,000 years ago. And each step is surrounded by an enormity of absence, a stule, silence so vast that the evidence we do possess amounts to scattered points of light in a darkness that stretches in every direction farther than we can see. The temptation is to fill that darkness with narrative, to connect the points into a line and call it progress, a story of ascent from primitive origins to modern complexity, each stage an improvement on the last, each innovation a step upward on a ladder that leads inevitably to us. But the evidence does not support that shape. Progress is not a natural law. For 190,000 years, humans with modern brains and modern bodies lived without producing anything that the archaeological record can identify as cultural complexity, and those 190,000 years were not a failure. They were a way of being human that worked, that sustained populations across climatic extremes, across continental distances, across more generations than any civilization has yet survived. The people who lived through that silence were not waiting for history to begin. They were living fully and completely in ways that did not require permanence to be real. Their lives mattered. Their knowledge was vast. Their experience of the world was as rich and as textured as any that has followed. It simply did not leave the kind of traces we have learned to look for. That recognition changes the way the surviving fragments feel in the hand. A shell bead from Blombos is not a primitive precursor to modern jewellery. It is an artefact of a complete world, a world with its own logic, its own values, its own understanding of beauty and identity and meaning, that happened to produce in this one instance an object durable enough to cross 100,000 years of silence and arrive in a museum case where we can look at it and wonder. The carved ochre is not a rough draft of Lascaux. It is a finished statement in a language we cannot read, made by someone whose sophistication we have no reliable way to measure, because the metrics we use are to ornament symbolic complexity are calibrated to detect only what survives, and survival is determined not by importance but by material and accident and the chemistry of soil. Most of what has ever been human is gone. Not destroyed, simply unmade by time, returned to the silence from which it briefly emerged. The songs are gone. The stories are gone. The conversations held beside 10,000 generations of fires, the laughter, the grief, the arguments about where to camp and when to move, and what the stars mean, all of it has passed through the world without leaving a physical mark. We are left with stones with bones, with a few extraordinary paintings and deep caves with genetic sequences that record encounters between species who could not have imagined that their brief unions would be legible 50,000 years later in a laboratory. These fragments are not the story. They are the residue of the story, the thin mineral deposit left behind after the water has evaporated and the river has moved on. But they are enough. Enough to know that the river was real. Enough to know that it was wide and deep and carried more than we will ever recover. Enough to feel across the full weight of 300,000 years the presence of people who are us, not preparing to become us, not evolving toward us, but already us, complete living in a world that asked everything of them and received in return everything they had. Their names are gone. Their faces are gone. But the ochre lines remain, and the shell beads and the handprints on the cave walls, and the quiet insistence repeated across millennia in every medium available that someone was here, that it mattered that the silence was never truly silent at all. The ochre is still there. Behind its glass case in Cape Town no larger than a palm, the cross-hatched lines still visible under museum light, each groove cut by a hand that held the stone steady and drew the point across its surface with intention, with pressure, with purpose. 100,000 years have passed since those lines were made. The cave where it rested has been excavated, catalogued, published in journals read by people on the other side of the planet. The ochre has travelled farther from its origin than the person who carved it could have imagined, if they imagined distance at all, if their sense of the world extended beyond the coastline and the hills and the faces of the people they knew. We will never learn what the pattern meant to them. We will never know if it was sacred or ordinary, whether it was the first of its kind or the last in a tradition already fading. The lines remain. The meaning behind them has returned to the silence it came from, and the silence, as it always does, keeps what it keeps without explanation. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from looking at the full span of human existence and recognizing how little of it we can access. 300,000 years of people living, thinking, choosing, loving, grieving, solving problems we cannot name in languages we will never hear. And from all of that, a scattering of stones, a few carved bones, some pigment pressed into the wall of a cave. The fragments are extraordinary. Each one represents an almost miraculous chain of survival. The right material, the right conditions, the right accident of burial and preservation that allowed an object to pass through millennia of rain and ice and shifting earth and arrive intact in the hands of someone who could recognize it for what it was. But the fragments are not the story. They are the residue of a story so vast that no amount of excavation, no refinement of dating techniques, no breakthrough in ancient DNA analysis will ever recover more than a fraction of what has been lost. Most of the human past is not hidden. It is gone, dissolved back into the soil and the air, and the deep time that does not distinguish between a king's tomb and a child's footprint in wet clay. And that is not a tragedy. It is simply the condition under which all life operates, the condition of impermanence of things existing fully and vividly in their moment, and then passing on, making room for what comes next. The people who carved the ochre at Blombos did not need us to remember them in order for their lives to have been real. The hunters who built the shelters from mammoth bones on the frozen steppe of Ukraine did not create those structures for the benefit of archaeologists who would find them 15,000 years later. The woman whose hand was pressed against the wall of a French cave outlined in blown pigment was not thinking about posterity. She was thinking about whatever she was thinking about, something we will never know, something that mattered to her in that moment, in that darkness, in that thin circle of firelight, and then she moved on and the hand stayed, and the centuries buried it, and the centuries uncovered it, and now it waits in the silence of the rock for the next person to look. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the not knowing is not a void to be filled, but a space to be respected. The acknowledgement that the past was populated by minds as complete and as private as our own minds, that did not owe us their secrets and would not have understood the question if we could somehow ask. The gaps in the record are not failures of history. They are the natural shape of time passing through material that was never meant to be permanent, carrying away everything, soft and leaving behind only what stone and bone and fired clay can hold. If you have followed this far through the long silence, through the ice and the migration and the slow entanglement with grain and settlement and written memory, then you have traced in outline the shape of a story that has no true beginning and no definitive end. It stretches behind you farther than you can see, and it stretches ahead of you into a future that the ochre carver could not have conceived, and that you in your own turn will not live to witness. You are somewhere in the middle of it. Everyone always is. Let that be enough for now, traveller. Let the weight of 300,000 years settle into something gentle, something that does not demand understanding, but only rest. The fragments will still be there in the morning. The ochre, the shells, the handprint on the wall. They have waited this long, they will wait a little longer. Close your eyes, let the silence hold what it has always held, and sleep knowing that the story continues quietly, patiently in the dark, whether anyone is awake to hear it or not.